this has helped me, just remembering this simple outline. Ever since I was 15, I can remember those 3 words: the cloud, the cry, and the curtain. And hopefully this will be a way, if someone asks you, what exactly was going on when Jesus died, you could go to Mark 15 and you can show them from the text what Jesus was doing through this simple outline. Well, before I go into the first point, the cloud, I was listening this morning to the fact that today the minimum wage has gone up, I think by about 30p, is that right? From £7.50 to £7.80 something. And there was a discussion on the radio about what's the cost of living. And it depended on whose cost of living and so on and circumstances. And they were saying if you move to another part of the world, then for the same amount of money you could get so much more. And the cost of living in London in particular is very high. And that's something we're thinking about all the time, especially as Londoners. What's the cost of living? But I suppose another question we perhaps don't think about so often is, what's the cost of sinning? What is the cost of having pushed God out of the picture? And we know what it's like to live in a fallen world, a broken world, a world where we don't get to see God and be with Him in that wonderful garden, as we're hearing about in that wonderful children's explanation. But when we look at the cross of Jesus Christ, and perhaps definitely even the passage before this, we get to see an impression of the cost of sinning, what it cost. And Jesus came to rescue us, to take that sin on Himself. And so as we look at Jesus, we see what sin cost. Well, let's go into our first point, the cloud. And that's there this is the most tenuous of the seas, but it's helpful nonetheless. Verse 33, do you see that right at the beginning of the passage that Chris read to us? Verse 33, at noon, middle of the day, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And this isn't just a cloud. This isn't just an eclipse. This is something extraordinary, supernatural. Somehow God has made it so that it feels like night when it's supposed to be the middle of the day. And darkness throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, is a picture of spiritual death, of uncreation. The God who spoke life into the world and started that by saying, "Let there be light," and light came out of darkness. Well, suddenly creation is unraveled. Darkness comes over, and it's a sign of God's anger against human sin. It's a sign of separation from God. The different pictures that the Bible uses for the concept of hell, for the concept of being cut off from God, well, darkness is used repeatedly again and again as a sign of God's anger, of separation from Him, of the consequences of us saying, "Shove off God." Well, then we will experience darkness if we continue in that attitude. But the question for the people here was, who was God angry with and why? And the natural assumption, perhaps for Jesus' followers and those who were sympathetic to Jesus, was that God was angry with the people for putting Jesus on a cross. But actually the answer to that question, who was God angry with, comes in the very next verse. At 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. And here we come from the clouds to the cry. The cry. And the surprising thing is that it seems to be that the separation, the darkness, the anger of God is not being poured out on the people who've put Jesus on the cross. But who's it being poured out on? Well, Jesus tells us Himself in His own words. He cries out in a loud voice, verse 34, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus, the one who never did anything wrong. Jesus, the one who lived in perfect relationship with his Father, had done for all eternity, and then took humanity to himself. And as a human being, as he grew up sinless. And he never knew a day when he wasn't trusting wholeheartedly in his Father, obeying him at every step, even to the point of death. And yet on the cross, Jesus was treated as we deserve, so that we could be treated as he deserves. That cry should have been our cry. And the question that Jesus asks, why have you forsaken me, isn't really because Jesus didn't know what was going on. You only have to read back a chapter into the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying the night before he went to the cross, and he knows exactly what he's going to face. He's going to face the anger of God as he prays in that garden with his anguish so high that his sweat forms like drops of blood on his skin, where he says, my soul is troubled with sorrow to the point of death. And he cries out to his Father, he says, Father, if there's any other way for people to be saved, may this cup be taken from me, but not what I will, but what you will. And that cup is clearly pointing back to the cup of God's anger against sin, God's hatred of all that is evil, God's good hatred of all that is evil. And Jesus knew that he was going to have to drink that cup so that those who trust in him wouldn't have to. So Jesus knew exactly what was going on, but why does he cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, it's because he's quoting a psalm. Jesus knew the Old Testament inside out. And that's, my God, why have you forsaken me, is the beginning of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 verse 1 starts with the great King David, who was God's anointed. In other words, God's Messiah. God's anointed king is the Hebrew word Messiah. David, who was the Messiah, the one who was there to be in charge of God's people but who failed, wrote a psalm. And there are many psalms like it known as messianic psalms. They're written from the point of view of the Messiah. And as the king of the Old Testament, King David, writes, and every time we see a psalm of David, often we read it and we think, oh, hang on a minute, that's exaggerated. That didn't happen to David, or David wasn't that great, and David certainly wasn't perfect. But as he's writing in prophetic language, looking forward to the true Messiah. And Jesus, as he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's as it were saying, just go back and read that psalm. Maybe that's something you could do to meditate this evening at the end of Easter Day. To meditate on Psalm 22, a psalm full of allusions to what's going to happen to Jesus, where he says, they cast lots for my clothing. They have pierced my hands and my feet, and so on and so on. Lots of allusions to what's happening in the psalm. But what you see in that psalm is the great king, the Messiah, suffering on behalf of his people. And Jesus is saying, even as he dies, he's crying out to let us know, I'm the one who was prophesied in Psalm 22. And of course, also in Isaiah chapter 53, which if you read Psalm 22, you sort of feel the message of Isaiah chapter 53 as well. And that's on the back of your sheets, if you just flick over. We're not going to read the whole thing. But if this is something that's not sort of flowing through your veins, Isaiah 53, then maybe this is a chance to meditate on it. We see the one who's despised and rejected by mankind there in verse 3 at the top. A man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised and we held him in low esteem. But what was going on the cross as Jesus was forsaken? Well, there we are, Isaiah 53 verse 4. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. So all the pain that we feel, all the suffering that we feel in this fallen world, Jesus has come to take that on himself. What's the price of our sin? Pain and suffering, and we see it horrendously as Jesus died on the cross. And yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by God and afflicted. But what was he doing? Verse 5. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him, on Jesus, the iniquity, the sin of us all. And we get to see more details in Isaiah 53 that actually in the reading that Chris read, we see fulfilled. So before Mark 15, we see Jesus on trial, silent like a lamb, before his shearers is silent, end of verse 7. We see him by oppression and judgment taken away. Then we see him, end of verse 8, cut off from the land of the living. And then verse 9, as the story continues, he was assigned a grave with the wicked. So there he is, dying on the cross with thieves left and right. But then with the rich in his death. Did you see that bit? In Mark 15, 43, Joseph Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, a wealthy man who had a massive tomb in his garden, came and asked for Jesus' body and buried him. He was assigned a grave. He would have been chucked into a pit with those thieves on the cross. But instead, a rich man came and put him in his tomb. This is written 700 years before Jesus. The cloud of God's judgment. The cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" showing that Jesus was the one taking the judgment of God. So that if we trust in him, we don't have to. And what's the result? What does that achieve? Thirdly, the curtain. I love that picture in that children's book, The Garden, the Cross and the Curtain. What does it achieve? What do you see, verse 37 and 38 on the sheets? Mark chapter 15, verse 37. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And as Mark's first readers were reading this, they might have thought, hang on a minute, this is really weird. We were just on one side, outside of Jerusalem, and yet Mark is recording something that happens the other side of Jerusalem in the temple. Why is he just suddenly zooming across? Well, of course, those who were in the temple would have remembered that earth-shattering, literally earth-shattering, there was an earthquake apparently, and that curtain being torn and them seeing it, then being able to do nothing about it down at the bottom as this high room which was blocked off by this amazing curtain into the Holy of Holies, the place where God symbolically dwelt, where this extraordinary curtain was torn in two from top to bottom, showing that God was opening the way into his presence. That no longer did people need to perform sacrifices in order to come into the presence of God. That's why the curtain was there, was to say, without a sacrifice, to die instead of you, and symbolically they used lambs and bulls and goats and so on, you may not come in. And the only person who could come into the Holy of Holies was the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, when bulls and so on would be sacrificed for his own sin. And then he would go in and make a sacrifice for the people inside the Holy of Holies, just to show just how holy God is. Like domestos bleach and germs. I find that a helpful comparison, that the holiness of God is so powerful, the purity, the cleanness of God, that for us to come into his presence is like germs coming into the presence of domestos bleach. And yet as Jesus paid the penalty himself, and his goodness was transferred onto those who would trust in him, and as he took our sin on himself, the way was opened, the curtain was torn in two, access to God was restored, and now it was finished. We're told Jesus breathed his last and the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. John records for us what the words of Jesus' loud cry were in verse 37. It is finished. It is paid in full. The way to God is guaranteed. Access to God was restored. Now, of course, it wasn't until that third day, that Easter day, that Jesus' followers knew that his death had achieved what it was meant to achieve. But at that moment, access was granted to all who would trust in Christ. Resurrection guaranteed. And if we're trusting in him, that resurrection life starts in part now. Paul says that it's as if we're spiritually raised with him. And so we can enjoy being in his presence. And the temple now has no purpose. And in fact, within a couple of decades, the temple was destroyed. Within AD 70, by AD 70, the Romans had come in and destroyed the temple, and the temple doesn't exist. There's a massive mosque in its place, even with the Jews back in Israel. And so the temple has no purpose now, because the way to God is through Christ. Well, finally, as we come to this last little section, and on this resurrection day, on Easter Day, we've seen the cloud of God's judgment, the cry that shows that Jesus took it, the curtain torn in two to show that access to God is back again. And lastly, your call. Your call. What will you do about it? And to just think about that, we're going to look briefly at chapter 16 and those first 8 verses. Mark writes, when the Sabbath was over, so they could do nothing because the Jews couldn't work on the Sabbath day, so they could do nothing on the Saturday. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. These are the same women that we're told in verse 40 had seen Jesus die. They knew he was dead. They'd seen him with their own eyes, dead. Verse 2, very early on the first day of the week, on the Sunday, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. The resurrection has happened. But Mark, differently to the other gospel writers, doesn't then record the events of how the disciples discovered that Jesus wasn't a ghost, that he was really real, that there's no other way that this event could have happened. No, Mark just leaves us with verse 8. This is the end of Mark's Gospel, verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now we know from the other Gospel accounts that these women were not only the first eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, they were the first evangelists, the first witnesses who went and did tell everyone. And it was through their initial witness that the gospel began to spread. These are great heroes of the faith. And yet Mark leaves us with the question, because I think he wants us to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with this information? What are we going to do with the reality that Jesus has taken the judgment of God for us? And that the way to God is opened, and that's proven by his resurrection, and we now enjoy resurrection life in him. What are we going to do with that? Because it's amazing news, isn't it? And yet the idea of heading out here and going and sharing that with the first person we meet, doesn't that fill us with a sense of fear and nervousness, and how will they take it? And hang on a minute, if they rejected Jesus when he shared such good news, are they going to reject me as well? And maybe our initial reaction will be like these women's initial reaction. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They had such amazing, life-giving news. And yet initially, their first reaction was to hold it to themselves. And you get this theme throughout the book of Mark, that he highlights this contrast between, in response to Jesus' power and wonder and goodness, will we be fearful or will we trust him? And that's the challenge to us this Easter day, the challenge from Mark in particular. If it was John, it would be different. If it was Matthew, it would be different. If it was Luke, it would be different. But the challenge from Mark is, what will we do with this momentous, life-changing news? Will we just keep it to ourselves? Or will we just see the wonder of it and go beyond our own desire for comfort and ease and not to rock the boat? And will we share it with others? Because it will be costly. Jesus made it very clear whoever would come after him must take up their cross and follow him, must be willing to go with him to death. And we need to die to our own scruples of rocking the boat and having awkward conversations. Because as soon as we tell people good news, they've got to understand the bad news first, haven't they? And so what will be our response? Fear or faith?